In the sweltering jungle of Guadalcanal, a handful of American pilots, flying planes held together by little more than scrap metal and sheer will, were about to face the full might of the Japanese Empire. They called themselves the Cactus Air Force, a joke born from the hellish muddy conditions of their makeshift airfield. To the supremely confident Japanese commanders sailing towards them in an invincible armada, they were a laughable nuisance, an insect to be swatted from history. Those commanders had no idea they were sailing into the jaws of a legend, a force that would not just defy them, but bleed their powerful navy dry and change the course of the entire war. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The rain was a physical presence at Henderson Field, a relentless drumming assault that turned the world to mud. It hammered the canvas of the leaking tents, cascaded in rust-colored waterfalls from the corrugated iron roofs of the makeshift huts, and transformed the vital runway into a treacherous ribbon of crushed coral and brown sludge. Late August in 1942 on Guadalcanal was not a place for the faint of heart. The air, thick and suffocating, was a cocktail of oppressive tropical humidity, the sharp tang of aviation fuel, and the sweet cloying scent of decay that clung to the jungle. Scattered among the battered palm trees, the entire American presence on the island felt temporary, a fragile foothold on the edge of oblivion. Shrapnel holes peppered everything that stood still for more than 5 minutes, a constant reminder of the nightly visits from Japanese naval guns and the daily air raids screaming in from Rabaul. Major John Griffin, known to his men as Griff, sat on an ammunition crate under the flimsy cover of a canvas awning, methodically cleaning his pistol. He was in his late 20s, but his eyes, weary and old, had seen enough for a man twice his age. As the leader of a wildcat squadron, the weight of command pressed down on him, a physical ache in his shoulders and a permanent furrow in his brow. The ritual of stripping, oiling, and reassembling the .45 caliber automatic was a small act of order in a universe of chaos, a way to steady his nerves when the shaking in his hands threatened to betray the strain. He worked with a practiced economy of motion, his knuckles scraped raw, his uniform stained with grease and sweat. Not far away, Lieutenant Ben Carter, who everyone called Benny, was wrestling with a piece of salvaged aluminum, trying to rivet it over a jagged bullet hole in the wing of his F-4F Wildcat. Benny was barely out of his teens, his face still holding the ghost of boyish softness beneath a new, hard-set jaw. He was a walking contradiction of youthful bravado and a deep, gnawing fear that he hid behind a quick grin and a steady stream of chatter. His plane, like all the aircraft in the Cactus Air Force, was a Frankenstein's monster. It was a patchwork of cannibalized parts, its engine prone to coughing fits, its tires worn smooth. The collection of Marine, Navy, and Army Air Forces squadrons were ill, exhausted, and outnumbered, fighting with machines that the mechanics kept flying through profane prayers and pure genius. "She'll fly, Griff," Benny called out, forcing a grin as he wiped sweat and rain from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Just needs a little love and a lot of hope." He gave the patch a final optimistic tap with his hammer. Griff didn't look up from the slide of his pistol. He could feel the familiar tremors of malaria beginning to dance in his bones, a low-grade fever that never quite left. "Hope doesn't plug fuel leaks, Benny," he said, his voice a low rasp. "But it's about all we've got. Just make sure that patch holds. We can't afford to lose another one." The words were clipped, devoid of comfort, but Benny understood the sentiment. Every plane was precious, every pilot irreplaceable. They were on their own, a tiny, isolated pocket of resistance against an empire that had conquered half the Pacific. Their meals were captured Japanese rice and the occasional tin of peaches. Their bodies were racked with dysentery and fungal infections, and their sleep was shattered by the nightly bombardments they called the Henderson Field Express. Yet, in the shared misery, A grim determination had taken root. They kept their weapons clean, their humor black, and their focus narrowed to the only thing that mattered, the next sortie. Miles away, on the calm, dark waters of the Solomon Sea, the atmosphere was one of serene and absolute power. The bridge of the Japanese battleship Hiei was a testament to the Empire's naval might. Polished brass gleamed under soft lights. The teak deck was spotless, and the officers moved with a quiet, disciplined confidence that bordered on religious fervor. Here, there was no mud, no malaria, no desperation. There was only the hum of perfectly maintained engines and the unshakable belief in victory. Admiral Tanaka Raizo stood before a vast chart table, his sharp, intelligent face illuminated by the glow of a gooseneck lamp. He was a veteran commander, respected for his tactical acumen, though his inherent caution often irritated the more aggressive firebrands on the Imperial General Staff. Commander Goro Watanabe, a young, ambitious staff officer with a pedigree that had fast-tracked his career, stood beside him, a faint sneer playing on his lips as he reviewed an intelligence summary. "Cactus Air Force," he scoffed, the sound sharp in the disciplined quiet of the bridge. "They name themselves after a desert plant in this jungle hellhole. It is a sign of their foolishness, their complete disconnect from reality." He tossed the report onto the table with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "A handful of broken planes and starving pilots. They are a nuisance, Admiral, not a threat, an insect to be swatted." Admiral Tanaka did not react immediately. His gloved finger traced the channel between the islands, the waterway the Americans would soon christen the Slot. He had seen too many battles, too many overconfident plans go awry, to share his subordinates' arrogance. He had learned that war was a thing of variables, and the most dangerous variable was the human spirit. "A cornered animal is often the most dangerous, Watanabe," he said, his voice even and low, his expression unreadable. "Do not underestimate their desperation. Their presence on that island, that pathetic little airfield, threatens our entire campaign for New Guinea. It is a bone in our throat, and it must be removed." Watanabe bowed stiffly, his pride stung by the mild rebuke, but the Admiral's words were lost on him. He saw only the overwhelming logic of numbers, the sheer tonnage of the Imperial fleet versus the pitiful collection of American remnants. The coming battle, in his mind, was not a contest. It was a simple, brutal extermination. The dramatic irony was a thick, unspoken presence on the bridge of the immaculate warship, steaming inexorably toward its own humiliation. The klaxon's shriek cut through the morning haze at Henderson Field like a physical blow. "Scramble! Bandits inbound!" The cry was echoed by running men, their feet sucking at the mud. Griff was already sprinting toward his wildcat, pulling on his helmet, the pistol now holstered at his side. Benny, his face pale but set, was right behind him. Ground crews, who had worked through the night to refuel, rearm, and patch the battered fighters, scattered as the engines coughed to life, spewing blue smoke. A handful of wildcats, no more than a dozen, taxied clumsily through the muck, their propellers churning the air as they fought for speed on the sodden runway. They climbed into the humid sky, a desperate patched-up squadron rising to meet an overwhelming force. Below them, the island was a carpet of suffocating green, and ahead, the sky was filling with black specks. An incoming wave of Japanese Betty bombers, sleek and silver, flew in a precise formation, escorted by the far more numerous and nimble A6M-0s. The air battle, when it came, was a chaotic, three-dimensional ballet of death. Griff, falling back on years of experience, ignored the tempting Zero escorts. He was a craftsman, and his job was to break the tools of the enemy. He saw the bombers as the true threat, the carriers of destruction for the Marines on the ground. He pushed his Wildcat into a dive, the engine screaming, his mind a cold calculator of angles, trajectories, and weaknesses. He wasn't thinking of glory or patriotism, only of the professional, chilling anger he felt toward the men in the silver planes who were trying to kill his men. His thumb squeezed the trigger, and the 50 caliber guns bucked in their mounts, sending streams of tracers lancing across the sky and into the fuselage of a Betty. Smoke, thick and black, began to pour from its port engine. For Benny, it was different. This was his first major engagement, and the sky had exploded into a terrifying kaleidoscope of motion. Zeros were everywhere, appearing as if from nowhere, their agility a stark contrast to his heavier, more sluggish Wildcat. He was overwhelmed, his training a distant memory in the face of the hot, immediate reality of combat. A Zero latched onto his tail, its guns winking like malevolent stars. The world became a blur of violent noise as cannon shells ripped through his wing, the same wing he had so carefully patched just hours before. Panic seized him, cold and absolute. He threw his plane into a wild, uncontrolled dive, the Zero flashing past him. He pulled back on the stick with all his strength, the damaged airframe groaning in protest as he leveled out just above the jungle canopy. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror and adrenaline. Griff watched the bomber he had targeted falter, then begin its long, slow spiral toward the sea. A grim, fleeting satisfaction touched him, immediately replaced by the acute awareness of his dwindling fuel and ammunition. He broke off his attack, rallying his scattered flight. They had done what they could. They had drawn blood. A few bombers and a Zero had been downed, a small but significant victory. But the cost was evident as they limped back toward Henderson Field. Benny's Wildcat was a wreck. The patch was gone, and the wind shrieked through a gaping hole in his wing. The controls felt loose and sloppy, and one of his landing gear struts refused to deploy fully. He fought the plane all the way down, his knuckles white on the control stick, his breath coming in ragged sobs. He landed with a jarring crash, the plane slewing sideways in the mud before shuddering to a halt. He sat in the cockpit for a long moment, shaking uncontrollably, the smell of cordite and his own fear filling the small space. The initial terror of the dogfight had given way to the high of survival, which was now crashing into the sobering reality of his battered plane and his own mortality. As the pilots climbed wearily from their cockpits, the ground crews were already swarming the planes. They were the true miracle workers of the Cactus Air Force, profane angels in grease-stained overalls. They descended on Benny's crippled Wildcat not with dismay, but with a determined, practical energy. They would work through the night, under the threat of bombardment, lit by shielded lanterns, performing their nightly ritual of resurrection. They would salvage, strip, and rebuild, their ingenuity and tireless labor the only thing keeping the Cactus Air Force in the sky. Griff stood on the edge of the runway, watching them, the weight of it all settling on him again. He felt a grim satisfaction in the day's work, but it was overshadowed by the heavy burden of responsibility for the young men he was leading through this crucible. They had survived another day. They had held the line. And tomorrow, they would have to do it all over again. The days at Henderson Field began to bleed into one another, each a smear of gray dawns, sweat-soaked afternoons, and terrifying nights. The routine was a liturgy of survival. Wake before sunrise, the air still cool and damp, to the taste of lukewarm coffee and a handful of captured rice. Then, the dawn patrol, climbing into the patched-up Wildcats to sweep the skies for the first sign of the daily raids from Raboul. The tension was a constant metallic taste in their mouths. Every cloud formation held a potential threat. Every glint on the horizon could be the sun flashing off the canopy of a Zero. The nights offered no rest. They were punctuated by the drone of a lone Japanese reconnaissance plane the men had nicknamed Washing Machine Charlie. It would circle for hours, a maddening, unseen presence in the darkness, occasionally dropping a single random bomb. Its purpose was not destruction, but erosion, to fray their nerves, to deny them the solace of sleep, to remind them that they were never, ever safe. More terrifying were the naval bombardments, when the massive guns of the Imperial Japanese Navy would open up from the blackness of the sea, sending shells screaming into the airfield. The world would dissolve into a cataclysm of noise and violent, earth-shaking impacts, the pilots huddling in their foxholes, feeling utterly helpless as the ground trembled and the air filled with the whistle of shrapnel. Benny Carter was no longer the fresh-faced rookie who had arrived on the island. The boyish softness in his face had been stripped away, replaced by the gaunt, hollow-eyed look of a veteran. He had lost weight he couldn't afford to lose, and a permanent tremor lived in his hands, but in the air, he was transformed. The hot panic of his first dogfight had been forged into a cold, sharp focus. He had listened to Griff, absorbing every lesson, every piece of hard-won wisdom. He learned to fight the wildcat's weaknesses and exploit its strengths. He stopped trying to turn with the nimble Zeros, a fatal mistake for a new pilot. Instead, he used the F-4F's superior weight and diving speed, climbing high above the enemy, then plunging down in a high-speed pass, firing a quick, disciplined burst, before using his momentum to climb away, refusing to be drawn into a swirling, low-speed dogfight he could not win. He was becoming a hunter, his movements economical, his eyes missing nothing. The true heart of the Cactus Air Force, however, beat in a sprawling, chaotic collection of tents and open-air workshops just off the main runway. This was the domain of Chief Mechanic Sully O'Connell. Sully was a grizzled, profane man in his 40s, with a belly that strained the buttons of his grease, blackened overalls, and a voice that sounded like rocks grinding together. He was a genius, a savant of salvage. He could look at a pile of twisted, smoldering wreckage that had once been a plane and see not a loss but a collection of spare parts. His crews worked around the clock, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of shielded lanterns, performing miracles with wrenches and rivets. One afternoon, Griff found Sully standing with his hands on his hips, admiring his latest creation. It was a wildcat, but a grotesque, misshapen version of one. The engine cowling was the wrong shape, and the landing gear looked strangely spindly. "What in God's name is that, Sully?" Griff asked, a rare smile touching his lips. Sully spat a stream of tobacco juice into the mud. "That, Major, is a flying machine," he growled. "This engine," he slapped the cowling, which rattled ominously, "came from a dauntless dive bomber we dragged out of the Lunga River. Had to remachine the mounts and jury, rig the fuel lines, but she'll give you an extra 50 horsepower. The landing gear is off a wreck we dragged out of the jungle, belonged to a Zero, if you can believe it. Had to weld extensions on the struts. And the gun sight," he grinned, showing a row of tobacco-stained teeth, "is from a captured Betty bomber. She's a Frankenstein, a goddamn monster, but she'll fly. Just don't ask her to do anything elegant, and for Christ's sake, be gentle on the landing." This was how they survived, through this relentless, desperate innovation. They developed new tactics to match their hybrid machines. Griff drilled his pilots in the Thatch Weave, a tactic developed by his friend, Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, where two wildcats would fly in formation, constantly turning toward each other. If a Zero latched onto one plane's tail, the other pilot would inevitably find the enemy crossing his gun sight. It was a simple, deadly piece of aerial choreography that turned two vulnerable targets into a mutually supporting killing machine. They were learning, adapting, and making the Japanese pay for every inch of sky. The war of attrition was a brutal, daily reality. One evening, a pilot named Miller, a quiet man who loved to talk about his farm in Ohio, didn't come back from the dusk patrol. There was no frantic radio call, no plume of smoke on the horizon. He was just gone. That night, Griff quietly packed Miller's few belongings, a worn Bible, a photo of a smiling woman, a half-finished letter, into a small wooden crate. There was no ceremony. There was no time for grief. Another pilot, a young Marine just off the boat, would be assigned Miller's tent and, soon, a plane to fly. The machine kept grinding on. The nature of that machine was about to change. The Japanese, frustrated by their inability to dislodge the Marines on the island, had adopted a new strategy. Every night, under the cover of darkness, a convoy of fast, sleek destroyers would race down the channel between the Solomon Islands, a waterway the Americans were now calling the Slot. They carried fresh troops, ammunition, and supplies to the Japanese forces on Guadalcanal, then vanished before dawn. The Americans, with grim humor, dubbed the nightly run the Tokyo Express. It was a lifeline that was keeping the enemy in the fight, and Griff and his men were ordered to cut it. The mission shifted from defense to offense. The pilots of the Cactus Air Force, now joined by squadrons of SBD Dauntless dive bombers and TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, began flying dangerous dusk and night missions. It was a different kind of war, a perilous, disorienting hunt in the vast, empty darkness over the sea. For Benny, flying cover for the bombers on his first night mission, the experience was profoundly unsettling. The world shrank to the faint green glow of his instrument panel. Below him, the Pacific was an abyss, a featureless black void that seemed to want to swallow him whole. He felt a profound sense of isolation, a tiny, fragile speck of life and metal suspended in an indifferent universe. The fear was different now. It wasn't the hot, sharp panic of a dogfight, but a cold, gnawing dread that settled deep in his bones. He was flying on instruments, his eyes straining for the faint phosphorescent wake of a ship that might not even be there. The strike was led by a Marine captain named Joe Foss, a quiet, unassuming man who flew with a cold, lethal precision. He was already becoming a legend, an ace who hunted Japanese planes with an almost casual intensity. Tonight, his targets were ships. The call came over the radio. A spotter plane had sighted the Express. "Tally-ho!" Foss's voice crackled, calm and steady. "Commencing attack run." Benny watched from his perch at 10,000 feet as the Dauntlesses peeled off one by one, their dark shapes plunging into the blackness below. He scanned the sky, his head on a swivel, searching for the inevitable Japanese night fighters. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Then, the darkness below was shattered by a brilliant flash of light. A second later, another. The bombers had found their mark. A cheer went up over the radio, raw and triumphant. Benny banked his Wildcat, looking down at the scene. One of the Japanese destroyers was burning fiercely, a funeral pyre on the black water. A third, massive explosion ripped it in half, the two sections glowing cherry red before they slid beneath the waves. It was a stunning, visceral victory. They were no longer just defending Henderson Field. They were no longer just surviving. They were actively crippling the enemy's ability to wage war. They were hunting the wolves of the sea, and for the first time, the hunters were bleeding. This was the turning point. The Cactus Air Force was no longer just a thorn in the side of the Japanese. It was a dagger aimed at the heart of their naval power. Aboard the battleship Hiei, the mood had changed. The supreme confidence that had filled the bridge just weeks before had evaporated, replaced by a somber, grim frustration. The polished brass seemed less bright. The disciplined quiet now felt heavy and oppressive. Admiral Tanaka stood in his quarters, staring at the large map of the Solomon Islands. It was now dotted with small black pins, each one marking the location of a lost imperial warship or a transport sunk with all hands. The reports were piling up, a litany of failure and loss that defied all logic. Commander Goro Watanabe stood before him, his face pale, his earlier arrogance completely gone, replaced by a sputtering, wounded disbelief. "They are like ghosts, Admiral," he said, his voice tight and strained. "We pound their airfield into dust with 16-inch shells, and by morning they are in the air again. We send our best pilots, our most experienced aces from the China campaign, and they are shot down by these mechanics with wings, flying planes made of scrap metal." He shook his head, unable to comprehend it. We lost another destroyer last night, the Fubuki, and 2 transports, over 1,000 men, gone." Admiral Tanaka slowly, deliberately, placed another black pin on the map near the island of Savo. He looked at Watanabe, his eyes dark with a weary understanding that his subordinate still could not grasp. "We underestimated their will, Watanabe," he said, his voice a low murmur. "We saw their lack of resources, but we did not see their resourcefulness. We counted their planes, but we did not count their spirit." He gestured toward the map, a graveyard of his ships. "This Cactus Air Force is bleeding us, one ship, one plane, one pilot at a time. We are losing face, which is a blow to our pride. But more importantly," his voice grew harder, "we are losing the campaign. We are losing Guadalcanal." A cold, quiet fury was building within the Japanese command. The humiliation was unbearable. This ragtag collection of starving pilots and their flying junkyard heaps were not just defying the empire. They were making a mockery of its vaunted naval power. Pride, as much as strategy, demanded a final, decisive response. A new plan was drafted. Born of desperation and wounded honor, they would commit everything. A massive, overwhelming force would be assembled, a fleet larger than any yet seen in the South Pacific, centered around the battleships Hiei and her sister ship, the Kirishima. They would sail down the slot, not under the cover of darkness, but in the broad light of day. They would sweep aside the pathetic American naval forces, and then they would sit off the coast of Guadalcanal and shell Henderson Field until it was nothing but a cratered, smoking wasteland, until every last American plane was a twisted wreck and every last pilot was dead. It was to be the final brutal solution to the problem of the Cactus Air Force. A great storm was gathering, a steel typhoon of immense destructive power, and it was heading directly for the muddy, insignificant little island that had caused the empire so much pain. The great storm broke over Guadalcanal in mid-November 1942. The alarm came not as a klaxon's shriek, but as a deep guttural roar that seemed to rise from the earth itself, the sound of hundreds of engines. The Japanese had come. The steel typhoon, born of wounded pride and strategic necessity, was finally making landfall. From the muddy edges of Henderson Field, the pilots of the Cactus Air Force could see it, a forest of steel on the horizon, a fleet so vast it seemed to mock the very idea of resistance. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers filled the sea, their silhouettes sharp and menacing against the morning sun. Above them, a cloud of aircraft swarmed like angry hornets. This was the all-out assault, the final brutal argument. Griff didn't waste time on awe or fear. He ran, his men running with him, a mad dash across the churned mud to the waiting wildcats. Every plane that could fly, every pilot who could stand, was thrown into the fight. There was no grand strategy beyond survival, no intricate plan beyond hitting the enemy with everything they had until they could hit them no more. As his Wildcat clawed its way into the sky, its engine protesting, Griff saw the full terrifying scale of the Japanese armada. At its heart were the 2 behemoths, the battleships Hiei and Kirishima, their massive pagoda like superstructures bristling with guns. They were steaming with an arrogant, deliberate slowness toward the island, their objective chillingly clear, to anchor off the coast and pulverize Henderson Field until it was nothing but a cratered, smoking wasteland. "Wildcats, Griff here," his voice crackled over the radio, miraculously steady in the face of the apocalypse unfolding before him. "Form on me. We're going for the big boy, the lead battleship. We're going to cut the head off the snake." It was a suicidal, breathtakingly insane idea. Pitting 50 caliber machine guns against the thick armor plate of a Congo-class battleship was like throwing rocks at a mountain. But Griff wasn't aiming for the mountain's base. He was aiming for its eyes. He led his squadron in a steep, screaming dive, ignoring the swarms of Zeros that rose like intercepting antibodies to meet them. The air became a solid wall of anti-aircraft fire, black puffs of flak blossoming all around them, the sky ripped apart by the fiery red lines of tracers. Griff narrowed his world, his focus shrinking until it contained only one thing, the complex, multi-tiered bridge tower of the Hiei. He held his fire, his knuckles white on the control stick, the ship growing in his sights until he could make out the individual glints of binoculars on the open bridge. "Now!" he yelled into his mask, and his thumb depressed the trigger. His 8 guns hammered, the entire airframe of the Wildcat shuddering as it spat streams of armor, piercing incendiary rounds. He swept his fire across the bridge, a furious, desperate scythe of hot metal. He saw glass shatter, steel peel back like fruit skin, and the small, dark figures of officers thrown into chaos. He pulled up, the G-force crushing him down into his seat, his wingman right behind him, their planes raking the command structure with a furious 30-second fusillade. They hadn't sunk the ship. They hadn't even seriously damaged its hull, but they had sown chaos and confusion at the very brain of the fleet. High-ranking officers were wounded, vital communications were severed, and the ship's complex fire control was momentarily blinded. It was a mosquito biting a giant, but the giant was now swatting at its own face, its majestic rhythm broken, its attention fatally diverted. While Griff led his mad charge, Benny was fighting a different, more personal battle. He was flying cover for a flight of TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, lumbering vulnerable planes that were the true ship killers. His job was to keep the Zeros off them, a task that felt utterly impossible as the sky filled with the agile, deadly Japanese fighters. He saw 2 Zeros drop out of the sun, a classic tactic, their guns already winking as they targeted the lead Avenger. Benny shoved his stick forward, diving to intercept, the lessons from Griff and his own near-death experiences now pure instinct. No turning, just speed and a single clean shot. He lined up on the trailing Zero, his borrowed gun sight from the captured Betty bomber settling on the red circle of the Hinomaru. He fired a short, precise burst, and the Zero's wing simply disintegrated. The plane cartwheeled into the sea, a testament to Sully's Frankenstein craftsmanship. He pulled up, searching for the second Zero, finding it locked on the tail of an Avenger, tracers already streaming past the bomber's cockpit. He rolled in behind it, the Japanese pilot so focused on his prey, he never saw the ghost on his tail. Another burst, and this one exploded, a brilliant, shocking flower of orange and black against the blue sky. But his victory was short-lived. As he broke away, a third Zero, unseen, stitched a line of cannon shells across his fuselage. The world became a symphony of destruction. His instrument panel shattered into 1,000 pieces, the engine seized with a gut-wrenching scream of tortured metal, and flames began to lick at his feet through the floorboards. The stick went limp in his hands. He was a passenger in a falling coffin. With a final desperate act of will, he jettisoned the canopy, which ripped away into the slipstream, unbuckled his harness, and threw himself out into the terrifying, empty sky. He felt a searing pain in his arm as he tumbled through the air, then pulled the ripcord. The silk canopy blossomed above him with a reassuring crack, and he floated down, watching his burning Wildcat plunge into the dense green carpet of the jungle below. The battle raged for 2 days and 2 nights. The American Navy, outgunned but not outfought, steamed into the slot to meet the Japanese fleet in a series of brutal close-quarters night battles that sailors would later call the barroom brawl with the lights out. It was a sailor's nightmare, ships blasting each other to pieces at point-blank range. The combined pressure, the relentless, desperate attacks from the Cactus Air Force by day and the savage fury of the U.S. Navy by night was too much. The unbreakable Japanese will began to crack. Benny landed hard in the upper branches of a massive banyan tree, the impact jarring his already injured arm and sending a wave of nausea through him. He hung there for a moment, suspended between the sky and the earth, the sounds of the distant battle fading, replaced by the deafening electric cacophony of the jungle. Pain, sharp and white, hot, shot from his shoulder down to his fingertips. He managed to unclip himself from the parachute harness with his good hand, dropping the last 10 feet to the spongy, moss-covered ground with a grunt. He lay there, gasping for breath, the humid air thick and heavy in his lungs. He was alive, injured, alone, and surrounded by thousands of enemy soldiers, but alive. The jungle was a living entity, a suffocating world of greens and browns, filled with the chittering, buzzing, and slithering sounds of unseen creatures. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and sweet cloying rot. Alone, with the adrenaline of combat draining away, leaving only a deep, bone-weary exhaustion and the throbbing, insistent pain in his arm, Benny began to walk. He had a compass and a vague sense of direction. Henderson Field was to the east. He pushed his way through thick hanging vines and giant ferns that seemed to grab at his clothes, the canopy above so dense that the light was a dim green twilight even at midday. He thought about the past few months, a lifetime compressed into a single brutal season. He remembered the boy who had arrived on this island, so full of bravado and ill-concealed terror. That boy was gone, burned away in the crucible of dogfights and sleepless nights. He thought about the faces of the men he had lost, their laughter echoing in his memory, ghosts in this green hell. He thought about Griff, the weary, unshakable rock of their squadron, and Sully, the profane magician who could raise planes from the dead. He thought about the strange, unbreakable bond that had been forged between them, a brotherhood born not of choice, but of shared misery and a stubborn collective refusal to die. He was no longer a boy playing at war. He was a survivor, a veteran. The words felt strange, too heavy for his young shoulders, but they were true. He had looked into the face of death and had not blinked. He had killed, and he had watched his friends die. The jungle, with its primal, indifferent presence, seemed to strip away everything but the essential truth of his own existence. He was just a man, small and fragile, but he was still moving forward. His journey through the jungle was a pilgrimage, a painful, solitary walk through the wreckage of his own innocence. On the second day, delirious with fever from an infection in his arm, he stumbled into a clearing and collapsed. He was found by a Marine patrol, their dirty, bearded faces looking down at him like angels from a forgotten world. They gave him water, dressed his wound as best they could, and carried him back to the field. When Benny returned to Henderson Field, it was to a scene of carnage and triumph. The battle was over. The great Japanese fleet was in full, disastrous retreat. The ground was littered with the wreckage of downed Japanese planes, their red sun insignia stark against the twisted, blackened metal. The Cactus Air Force, battered, bruised, and decimated, was victorious. The price had been staggering, but they had held, more than held. They had won. Griff stood on the edge of the runway as the sun rose, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. He watched the black smoke rising from the hulks of 2 Japanese transports beached and burning on the shore, a grim monument to the failed invasion. He felt no elation, no surge of victory, only a profound, soul-deep exhaustion and a quiet, overwhelming sense of relief. He had led his men through the fire, and against all odds, most of them had come back. He saw Benny walking slowly toward him, his arm in a makeshift sling, his face pale and drawn, but his eyes clear and steady. They stopped in front of each other, the mud sucking at their boots. There was no need for words. They had shared something that could never be spoken, a knowledge bought with blood and fear and the shared terror of the sky. In that silent moment, they were not major and lieutenant, but 2 survivors, 2 brothers bound by the shared ordeal. Griff simply nodded, a gesture of acknowledgement, of respect, of welcome home. Not far away, Sully and his crew were already at work. They swarmed over a freshly crashed Zero, not with curiosity, but with the professional eyes of butchers carving a carcass. Every intact instrument, every usable piece of wire, every patch of undamaged aluminum was a prize to be claimed. The war for them would never be over. There was always another plane to rebuild, another engine to coax back to life. A jeep sloshed through the mud and pulled up beside Griff. A clean uniformed officer from headquarters, a man whose face was unlined by exhaustion or malaria, hopped out. He looked around at the wreckage, at the grimy, tired faces of the pilots, with a kind of reverent awe. "Major Griffin," he said, his voice crisp and full of an energy that felt alien here. "What you've done here, what all of you have done, it's unbelievable. Washington is calling it a turning point, the turning point of the Pacific War." Griff looked away from the officer, his gaze falling on his pilots. They were gathered in small groups, some drinking coffee from tin cups, some just staring into space, their bodies slumped with a fatigue that went deeper than muscle and bone. They were boys, most of them, but they had the eyes of old men. "We just held the line, sir," Griff said, his voice quiet but firm, his words carrying the weight of all they had endured. "That's all. We just held the line." The story of the Cactus Air Force became a legend. In just a few brutal months, from August to November of 1942, this ragtag force, this collection of misfits in their patched-up planes, dismissed and underestimated by a confident enemy, had helped rewrite the history of the war. They had destroyed over 1,200 Japanese aircraft, and their relentless attacks on the Tokyo Express had helped sink dozens of warships, from destroyers to the mighty battleship Hiei, which, crippled by Griff's raid and subsequent attacks, was finally scuttled by the Japanese themselves, a humiliation of unimaginable proportions. They had not just held the line, they had broken the back of Japanese naval air power, a blow from which it would never fully recover. For Japan, it was a stunning, catastrophic miscalculation. The force they had dismissed as a nuisance had bled their navy dry. The legend was born from the mud and coral of Henderson Field, a testament to the power of resourcefulness over resources, of spirit over steel. A few weeks after the Great Battle, a new, hand-painted sign was erected at the entrance to the airfield. It was simple, almost crude, but it said everything. It said, "Welcome to Cactus."